Everybody back to session 2 of the TEQSA conference. Hello. So we're about to introduce the next session, and I'll be introducing Dr. Mary Russell, Chief Executive Officer of TEQSA, who's already on the stage, so I'll introduce you quickly. She's already organising everything. And Mary's background is really interesting because she's got a background in working in industry, working in education, and learning about regulation along the way. But now she's actually had an experience of regulation in different contexts over a 30-year background. So what fantastic expertise for the CEO of TEQSA. Mary today will be talking, the topic is how systems learn and how they fail, applying systems thinking to manage regulatory risks and build trust. So over to Mary for this session's panel.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to see you here today and to welcome you on behalf of TEQSA. So I'm actually just going to begin by introducing the three, I'm not going to introduce myself, I'm going to introduce the other two speakers who are going to be part of the session today. First of all, we're going to hear from Professor Carl Macrae, who is a Professor of Organisational Behaviour and Psychology at the Nottingham University Business School. Carl's super interesting because he brings together current best practice and best thinking around managing risk in complex organisations and very real and continued experience through his career about what that looks like at the coalface. So how to make that work in organisations that are underfunded, complex, have rapidly changing, endlessly changing profiles of consumers, have lots of staff, some stable, some coming in and out of the organisation. I won't ask you to show your hands, but I think you'll start to see some of the parallels of the experience that he can bring around governance and risk-based regulation that is relevant to the challenges that we're facing now. And then also in this session, we're going to hear briefly, but importantly, from Professor John Pollaers. John is the Chancellor of Swinburne University and is the convener of the University Chancellors Council, but I would also describe him as not only a passionate advocate for change, but also a very passionate advocate for governance. And John will share with you a little snapshot about some of the work that the University Chancellors Council is already putting into action to try and strengthen the quality of governance in Australian higher education. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Professor Carl Macrae, who will speak first, and then you'll hear a little bit more from me about TEQSA's take on the topic for this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm keen really to start with a question, which is how do we develop more learning-oriented systems-focused approaches to risk management in our institutions? And to explore that question, I thought I might start really from the very beginning, for me at least. This is where I was born, in Sutton Coldfield, which is a small town about half an hour north of Birmingham in the British Midlands. About a mile or so away from the hospital, there's a bit of a nasty junction called Manny Corner, and around the 100 years ago in the 1910s, 1920s, when motor cars first started proliferating on the roads, this was a nasty hotspot for crashes. And after a number of deaths and fatalities, some local folk got together, decided, they weren't very happy about this. This was a bit of a problem that they were genuinely concerned about, and they invented a new and experimental technology of risk control. They painted some white lines down the middle of the road, and this was the first time anywhere in the world people had done this, and it became pretty apparent pretty quickly that this was a useful thing, and it worked, and within 5 years' time it had become one of the national standards, and I'm sure I've spotted a few out here in Melbourne as well. So I think to me this is a perfect example of what the work of risk management looks like. It's about people noticing there are problems, people feeling compelled to do something about it, people working together, collaborating, coming up with solutions, testing the solution, seeing if it works, If it does, scaling it up, rolling it out, and building it across an entire system. And while that's a simple example, I think the fundamentals are still the same, even when you're dealing with risk in complex systems. But the challenges are obviously much different, much more complex, and much harder to grapple with, which I won't need to emphasize to you, given this is much of your day job. And this is particularly the case given our current context of rapid technological change, significant policy shifts, financial constraints, increasing and quite sharp public scrutiny of our institutions, and many sectors are experiencing this across all different industries. Now, higher education isn't the only sector that is grappling with these challenges of how to manage complex risks. Other sectors have been on this journey, and some of them are a bit further down the road, in fact, which gives us a lot of opportunities to both learn from the sorts of effective strategies and practices and habits and systems that have been tried and developed in other sectors, but it also gives us a chance to learn from their dramatic failures as well, which I think is very useful for us to get an insight into what we're trying to avoid. So first, I just wanted to get a sense of why is managing risk so hard in complex organisations. We're lucky that we've got over 50 years of really sophisticated research in this field, stretching back to really the 1970s when this started to become a focus of academic interest. And as an academic, if you'll spare me 30 seconds to reassure you, there is some literature in this field. Really, a lot of the focus on the challenges of managing risk in complex organisations is that the early signs of emerging risks are often quite hard to spot because, by necessity, they're weak. They're weak signals. They're things that haven't been experienced before, and they're often identified and discovered by people on the periphery, voices that are easy to minimise or to discount. Likewise, there's the foundational work of Charles Perrault on how complex systems, problems and failures which occur in different parts can cascade very quickly in unexpected ways through complex organisations. The fundamental work on organisational error, all human, organised human activity, error is a natural part of being human. That's why we have checks and balances and risk controls, but it also means that those checks and balances and risk controls are actually perforated by errors and reliability issues at the same time. And then wonderful work from Diane Vaughan on the normalisation of deviance, where small deviations from accepted practices gradually become the new accepted practice, and it takes continual work to try and maintain what is appropriate behaviour in different cultures and contexts. So managing risk is difficult. You don't need me to tell you this. This is many of your day-to-day work. But also, I think it's important to highlight just the complexity of the sources of risk in our institutions and in many other complex organisations. And risks can arise from structural arrangements of our institutions and our sector. So think of the tight dependencies between international student revenue and changes in government policy and immigration policy. Think of the organisational sources of risks, that perhaps staff turnover, retirements, loss of institutional memory and experience, which can leave gaps in how organisations understand how to deliver what they're doing. Think of the technological sources of risk, the rapid emergence of generative AI, which has not only challenged assessment security, but our very fundamental understanding of what it means to learn and generate knowledge. Think of the epistemic risks, how we actually know about risks and we understand our organisation, how hard it can be to integrate all the different sources of information across different silos of data. And the cultural sources of risk. Are we creating a culture where people feel free and supported and enabled to speak up and then are listened to, and their insights and experiences are heard and acted on? So complex systems generate complex risks, and we need to be mindful of what that looks like, and particularly what it looks like when these things come together and can essentially bring an organisation to the point of major failure or collapse. So let me take you back to another hospital in the British Midlands, Stafford Hospital, where in 2005 things had started to go wrong. At first it was fairly subtle, a ward that seemed short-staffed, call bells that were left unanswered, patients that were waiting for help that never quite seemed to arrive. But gradually the cracks expanded, and soon enough families began to notice that their loved ones were being left dehydrated, confused, frightened, in pain, and nurses were running from crisis to crisis with no time to offer the care that they knew was needed. Over 4 years, things dramatically deteriorated at Mid Staffordshire NHS Foundation Trust, and behind the scenes, leaders were fixated on meeting financial targets to achieve their coveted Foundation Trust status, cutting nursing numbers to meet cost pressures without really any attention to the quality or risk implications, satisfying external bodies that they were in compliance with all of the standards that were required. And when attention was brought to their outlying mortality rates, they actually set about challenging how the mortality rates were calculated and how data was coded, rather than using that as an opportunity to reflect on and explore the performance of their own organisation. Patients and staff who raised concerns had their issues minimised, or in some cases were vilified and bullied. And over the period of 4 years, many hundreds of patients were subject to appalling failures in care, and the still unknown number died needlessly. By the time patient campaigners and staff whistleblowers had managed to bring attention to this, it had become one of the largest disasters that the NHS had ever seen. The public inquiry that was published in 2013 from Sir Robert Francis ran to over 1,000, just under 1,800 pages. The first 90 pages alone simply documented all the sources of information and evidence that was available to demonstrate how this trust was deteriorating and slipping into such a poor state. For example, the first 3 months of 2007, staff were reporting at least, submitting one incident report every single day on poor and inadequate staffing numbers within the trust. So this was summarised in Sir Francis' conclusions as it's clear that in spite of the warning signs, the wider system did not react to the constant flow of information, signalling cause for concern. And leaders failed to appreciate the enormity of what was happening, reacted too slowly, if at all, to some matters of concern of which they were aware, and downplayed the significance of others. I think this can be usefully summarised by essentially the overall findings here could be restated as disaster-provoking events accumulate because they've been overlooked or misinterpreted as the result of false assumptions, poor communications, cultural lag, and misplaced optimism. I think that's a very useful summary, but it was also written 4 decades before the Mid Staffordshire inquiry. This was Barry Turner's work in the 1970s, examining a range of organisational failures in the 1960s and 70s. And so what we tend to see are the same sorts of patterns repeated again and again in organisations that fail and that fail to manage risk to the public effectively. And what's striking is that we see this across many sectors. These same patterns were in the more recent Boeing 737 MAX case and many other countless instances. And what this really comes down to, I think, and what the purpose of risk management is essentially seeking to avoid, is this sense that the management system gradually loses touch with its operational realities, and both internal reality of the organisation and the external operating environment. And so much of the work of risk management is actually about learning. It's actually about trying to continually stay in close contact with the operational reality, the organisation reality. How is your institution delivering what it's meant to be delivering? What are people's experiences? And I think we don't perhaps always think about risk management as a learning activity. We perhaps think of it as a calculative process, or maybe a documentary process, or an administrative process, keeping risk registers up to date and committees to be worked through and actions to be noted. But when it's done well, I think risk management really is a process of learning. It's work that's directed at continually understanding the history of your organisation, the current state, and the future trajectory. So what does that look like? Well, we explored some of this in a workshop that I know quite a few of you were at yesterday. So to give a recap and a flavour of that we have a wealth of evidence on what are the cultural and organisational characteristics of this work that enables you to learn about and continually stay in close touch with organisation reality, with the risks and the challenges in your institution. And the work in sectors which often seem quite exotic compared to higher education, things like air traffic control centres, nuclear power plants, large commercial airlines, these sorts of settings, but it reliably identifies a set of key practices and habits. Well, one is that people are highly preoccupied with risk, and this doesn't mean they just write very, very long risk registers. It means that they are very, very attentive and have a real clarity about what are the things that could really harm people, what are the things that could really go wrong, how could we, and for us it would be how might we actually harm our students, how might our staff get harmed, how could our credibility, our viability be damaged. Second is a real sensitivity to practice, maintaining management processes, data collection, structures, and attentiveness to actually the rich reality of how work is being done in the organisation. There's a lot of emphasis on engaging very genuinely with a diverse set of perspectives, experiences, knowledges, and approaches to thinking about problems. And this is about creating ways of engaging with people at the periphery, perhaps, of conversations ordinarily, people who being curious about people's perspectives and bringing different voices and understanding into the conversation. There's often a lot of attention paid to the expertise around risk, who is able to actually take on the responsibility for managing risk, who has a particular knowledge and insight, and often some of these very high-performing organisations are very generous with the term expertise. They're keen to engage with experts by experience, effectively people who are closest to the sharp end, people who have experience and expertise of how things actually work. And then finally, there's a deep commitment to learning, and not learning in our sense of teaching and learning, but learning it in terms of continually renewing and improving and refining systems and processes and practices, and using any opportunity to do that. So it's all very well describing those principles, and they're obviously quite aspirational. And there's around 40 years of work that has gone into identifying and characterising what that can look like in certain types of organisations. But I thought I would just give you 6 brief signposts for how organisations can start moving in this direction. So the first is what you tend to see in organisations that are really attentive and really proactive and focus on learning as an approach to risk management, is that they don't just focus on events, complaints, disruptions, changes in policies, surprises, but they use events to try and generalise to a certain type of risk that they're managing. They spend a lot of time thinking, we can handle this, but actually, what would it look like if it happens again slightly differently? What would it look like if it happened over there rather than over here? So there's a movement from thinking not just about events that you handle moment by moment, but the actual underlying risks and what your capabilities are to handle those risks for the long term. Second, there's a focus on outcomes. Now, outcomes and harm and adverse events are important. So serious misconduct, student harm. These are all critical things that rightly demand attention. What you tend to see in a lot of other high reliability sectors is that they also spend a lot of time focusing on bad things that haven't happened. So thinking about not just it was a near miss, we were quite lucky, but it was a near miss. What does that tell us about our capacity to be resilient and control problems that are similar to that in future? So thinking about risk controls not just in terms of a particular adverse outcome, but actually a capacity for resilience to certain types of events. There's a set of practices around not just the routine repair that is needed on an ongoing basis in organisations, continually updating training and revising policies and reminding people of procedures, but actually using every opportunity to think about re-engineering systems, actually thinking about how processes can be redesigned in light of experience. There's a lot of attention in many high reliability organisations around not just relying on the structures of governance and leadership and reporting lines, which we all know and love, and a key requirement of any formal organisational structure, but they spend an enormous amount of time creating other spaces to bring people together that are outside those formal reporting lines, that create spaces where people feel safe, where people feel protected to be able to speak up, where there is essentially the infrastructure for curiosity, for avoiding filtering information as it moves up the organisational hierarchy. There's a lot of attention in high reliability organisations not just on producing justifications for decisions and justifications for why risks have been effectively controlled or managed, but actually really building an infrastructure that supports asking questions, and really hard questions that people probably don't yet know the answer to. If you've ever encountered the sort of risk management systems or the safety management systems that are present in organisations like big airlines, they really look like essentially an infrastructure for asking questions, distributing questions around the organisation, sending out questions to people to constantly think about how is that working in your part of the organisation? Are you comfortable with the way this seems to be happening? We've seen this. Have a look at that. Come back to us. And they know at the same time they're producing an auditable record, but the point is asking the question, being curious and exploring how things are working in your organisation. So a move from justification to exploration. And then finally, a focus on data. We're all awash with data in any institution and every complex organisation, but a lot of high reliability sectors spend an enormous amount of time thinking about not just the technical infrastructure for collecting and collating and analysing data, but actually the social infrastructure for who needs to be brought together to interpret, to make sense, to really interrogate and understand what this means for us right now and for the different groups and communities that we're part of. So there's a move from data to focusing on supporting and enabling sense-making. So those are my 6 signposts, I think, that can help us perhaps move along the road, and we'll all be at different points of that journey. But I really, my sense is really none of this is straightforward. None of it's this simple. Otherwise, you would all have a lot less work to do. I'd have not much to study. And but essentially, risk management is a process. It's a continual process of learning. And perhaps I can just end up back on those dotted lines again. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. I think it's helpful for us to acknowledge the complexity of this. Governance and risk management is inherently complex, and the more complex our external environment and our organisations are, the more difficult it is. Which is where I think that the sorts of principles that Carl has shared are really helpful because they are implementable and translatable and actionable. But we'll talk more about that later. Next we're going to give you a short, sharp presentation from Professor John Pollaers, who is going to share with us some kind of key initiatives around governance and trust that are being led by the University Chancellors Council. Then I will speak, and then we'll welcome your questions as a panel. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mary, and thank you, Carl. I think the first point that I want to make today is to really recognise that universities are living systems. And when they work because people are talking to each other, they're listening to each other, and they're learning from each other. And they go wrong when we shut down, when we assume the worst, and when we stop sharing what we're seeing. And the one thing that I've consistently said through a career of reform, I've led reform in the aged care sector, in the preventative health sector, particularly around alcohol abuse, in advanced manufacturing, in vocational education and training, and now in the area of energy transition. That one way or another, good governance comes when you take time to reflect. And even if a concern is raised, no matter how unfair it might feel, and I've heard that said a lot across the sector over the last couple of years, it's important that we take the time to stop, to pause, to listen, to explore, to check our systems and culture, and just to identify those areas where we can improve and continue to expand the invitation for people to engage in those governance challenges. So it's not about being defensive, it's not about being weak, but it is about being responsible. And too often we find that we resort to our old models of thinking. And we might talk a little bit about social licence later on, but when the University Chancellors Council commissioned some work to look at the crisis of social licence within the sector, we discovered that a new model was required for thinking. But what do you think the response we got from many across the sector was? We have our own model. When the racism survey commenced its journey through the universities, what was the biggest objection coming out of the sector? It was a challenge over whether the survey was being constructed properly, rather than engaging in the survey. And so too often our thinking is fixed and we're not opening our minds to other ways of looking at the problem. The very thing we teach our students and the very thing our researchers do, we don't do. Professor Macrae's work, if you haven't read it, is terrific. It's actually a good read, Carl. But is that there are small signs, which Carl referred to as weak signals, the things that are easily dismissed, that they don't look serious at that point in time, and yet what happens over time is those signals build up and build up. So wage underpayment across the sector. There'll be universities say it wasn't a big problem for us, and then there'll be others that'll say it wasn't a big problem for us. When you have 39 universities with that little problem, it becomes a very large problem, and that's a systemic issue. And we haven't been good at looking for systemic failure across our system. And what's even more damaging is that when we've seen them, the natural historic reaction with the existing models is to defend, then go away and try and come up with a solution, and then push the solution out, rather than acknowledging the problem, engaging to better understand the problem, working with those who have expertise, and then co-creating a solution, then checking that it's actually working. I'm very wary today of throwaway and pejorative statements like the statement management overreach. Because what it does, and what it does to councils and what it does to leadership teams, is it shuts people down. It pits one group in governance against another group in governance. And the problem is that perpetuates a situation where that artificial line means that issues aren't uncovered and those weak signals don't find their way through. And so each one of us in the room today who are in the business of running these institutions need to be mindful that what is sometimes referred to as management overreach needs to be interpreted as governance assurance. The need to go and check that the things that are happening, because otherwise we'll continue with what we have today. Great governance when you read it on paper, but not great governance in the lived experience of the people that we work with. So stronger governance is about clearer roles, good information flow, and predictable ways in which these things can be raised and be dealt with. I do believe, though, we're at a point now where a large conversation is starting to rise, and that is how do we ensure that student and staff voices are heard? How do we make sure that those weak signals get through? And not by symbolic or performative approaches, but by real representation, by real staff and student advisory forums that feed directly into council for decision making. Students and staff often see things before anybody else. And if we're going to deal with that, we need to remove this artificial divide between academic and professional leadership. If you look at the top paid people in the university, let's just say 60 or the top 100, it'll be roughly 50-50 will be professional and academic. They are all senior management of the university, and they all have an incredible role to play in picking up those signals. So at the University Chancellors Council, we are really attempting to shift the thinking, the models of thought. Even Carl referred to risk management, not just to look at hazards in risk, but what's the outrage issues in the community that represent very real risks also. The bottom line is the sector now needs to act as one. It needs to reflect upon its role as a learning system, engage the full line, if you like, between staff, students, council, government, governing bodies, etc. Because the bottom line is systems don't fail because of lack of rules. They fail because people stop listening to each other. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Carl. There's lots of really good segues in there about the importance of being attentive to the gaps and the points where things are perhaps not managed enough. And that's where I'm really going to pick up the discussion in terms of what this means and this question of trust and confidence means from TEQSA's perspective. So for any of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Mary Russell. I'm the CEO of TEQSA, and as you've heard, I've been kind of dealing with these complex questions in the context of practice and regulation for more years than I care to admit. So today what I want to do is talk to you about how TEQSA is evolving and rebalancing our regulatory approach. And this aligns very much with thinking about what some of these challenges are that are currently occurring and being acknowledged and responded to in the sector. It'll be no surprise to anybody in this room that we're talking about changing TEQSA's regulatory approach because it's been a continuing conversation between us over several conferences that change is needed. Over the past year, the higher education sector has faced intense scrutiny, complex challenges, and public debate about governance, integrity, and accountability. It's not been comfortable. In essence, this is what everybody in this room is responsible for and what we must respond to in practical ways every single day. These pressures and challenges across the sector are very real, and they speak to the importance of what we do. For TEQSA, they reaffirm that regulation must adapt to the environment in which we operate. We must evolve to meet the expectations of students, the public and Parliament, while continuing to uphold confidence and the reputation of Australia's higher education sector. I'll talk about why TEQSA must evolve, what this change will look like, and how we work with you to make sure that the strategy that we're going to be implementing delivers what the sector, students and the public need most. This should not be seen as a departure from good regulatory practice. Rather, it's an update of TEQSA's approach to reflect its maturity as a regulator and to align with what modern good regulatory practice looks like across comparable frameworks in Australia and internationally, as well as making sure that we're positioned and equipped to respond to the challenges in the sector. So regulation of our sector exists to uphold the quality, integrity and reputation of Australian higher education. When those things are strong, students' interests are protected and Australian higher education remains trusted at home and respected abroad. This is important to us all, including students, as they shared with us really, really passionately yesterday. That relationship between quality, integrity, reputation and student protection sits at the heart of TEQSA's work and at the centre of the changes that we're discussing today. We're making 3 major shifts in our regulatory approach. We're changing the way that we look at risk. We're changing our processes to make sure that they're targeted and that wherever possible we're reducing the regulatory burden. And we're rebalancing the way we apply our resources and our efforts between individual provider quality assurance and responding to sector risks. So these shifts are informed by what we've learned from our own regulatory practice, from various government inquiries that I'm sure you're all aware of, and what we've heard directly from you. So the consultations, the sessions, including those that we've conducted at conferences over recent years, have helped to inform the changes that we're making. So today also marks the start of consultation on the development of TEQSA's regulatory strategy, our shared opportunity to shape how we regulate, where we focus, and how we maintain confidence in the years ahead. The environment in which higher education now operates is testing all of us. Public attention has sharpened, expectations of accountability have increased, and the sector's reputation depends on our collective ability to respond with integrity and transparency. And I think the comments that we've heard today about the importance of really embracing a culture of questioning and being open and being on the front foot about identifying and responding to issues is really critical here. When TEQSA was established, the sector was smaller, it was much less diverse, and it was comparatively stable. The risk models that we at TEQSA have used over many years provided some insights to what was happening with individual providers, but time has shown the limits of our risk framework. The framework that we've had relies heavily on limited and lagged data. It cannot always account for the different ways that institutions manage their risks and how they assure quality or manage governance. The risk model we've had can overstate or understate risk when context is missing. And I imagine many of you are doing a very deep sigh about the frustrations you've had in trying to make sure that that risk rating that's produced annually in some way aligns with your understanding about what's happening now in your organisation. So recent inquiries, including the Senate inquiry into governance at Australian universities and the work of the Expert Council on University Governance that Melinda spoke to this morning, have drawn attention to weaknesses in governance and transparency across parts of the sector. They've also highlighted the importance of regulation that identifies and responds to risks across the sector early. It's evident that regulators and other agencies need to be clearer and more connected, as well as more capable of acting where risks threaten the integrity of the system. And this goes to the kind of complexity and multiplicity of agencies that are involved with our higher education sector. When governance and integrity falter, the consequences are felt first by students, in their experience, in their confidence, in the credibility and reputation of their qualifications. Protecting quality, integrity and reputation means recognising those early signs of risks and acting before confidence is lost. TEQSA's evolving regulatory approach directly responds to some of these pressures. So to meet expectations and regulate effectively, TEQSA is taking 3 deliberate steps as part of developing and implementing a regulatory strategy. First, we will retire our old quantitative risk assessment model for individual provider risk assessment. So this is the model that has been used to generate those annual provider risk assessments. Second, we will reduce prescription and paperwork in our assessment processes, focusing instead on what matters most, evidence of the effectiveness and maturity of providers' own management of key risks. Third, we will rebalance our focus between individual provider and system-wide risks, and I'll expand upon each of these in turn. I was expecting more groans about our risk assessment framework, I have to be honest. So I know it's a pain point for so many of you. The risk framework that TEQSA has been using for many years has delivered a consistent snapshot of individual provider risk. But as I said, it does not always provide an accurate or nuanced picture of that risk or how well it's being managed. It relies on lag data that sometimes is at least 2 years behind, as well as being outcome data. So it doesn't necessarily tell us much about what you're doing at the moment or how things may have changed. It cannot capture governance, capability, culture, or the impact of providers' own management of risks. And I think at TEQSA we're becoming increasingly focused on the difference between how we understand your underlying risks and what the risks are that persist after you've done your best to manage them with wherever you're up to at that particular time. So risk controls and our response to risk controls become more important. Moving forward, the calculations will continue to be made, but they'll only be used to monitor trends across the sector and over time. So we'll still be using those data because they're not unhelpful, they're just not useful for assessing and responding to individual provider risks. They will not determine any assessment decisions for individual providers or be used in any way to attribute costs for assessment to individual providers. They'll only be used to help us monitor and maintain that picture of sector risks. So we're moving from our previous risk framework to develop and apply a new risk and quality framework for our work with individual providers. Many of you have provided early input into the risk and quality framework through early workshops and targeted consultation, including at last year's conference. So while this work is ongoing, the finished product will be a model that combines quantitative data with much more qualitative and nuanced assessment. The development of the risk and quality framework addresses two key issues. First, the new framework focuses on management of risks that are aligned with the threshold standards. So it much more clearly makes that link between expectations that providers should meet under the standards and how that's represented in key areas of risk. Secondly, it will increase focus on evidence of the effectiveness and reliability of the provider's own management of key risks. Regulatory responses from TEQSA will be informed by assessment of the extent and significance of unmanaged risks. These changes will support a regulatory approach which more closely aligns to activities that providers should already have embedded in their practice. We're planning to consult on the risk and quality framework in the first quarter of 2026, so next year, and this will include a series of informal sessions where we'll be seeking feedback on how the framework should be rolled out, how it can give providers clearer visibility of TEQSA's view of risk and what it means for you, and implementation considerations from providers' perspectives. We're really aware that changes in our regulatory approach have implications for you that sometimes have a long lead time. So this work will be a central pillar of our regulatory strategy because the framework will underpin how we assess and respond to risk in the years ahead. The second area of change is increasing TEQSA's focus on assessing evidence of the effectiveness of providers' own risk management and self-assurance. In the past, as many of you will know, TEQSA's assessment approach has been very document heavy. And sometimes it's been too prescriptive about the evidence that we expect to see, not necessarily clearly linking that to the provider's circumstances and risks. We've often required the same material for most providers, regardless of the scale or types of education activities conducted or the students they worked with. That approach has created effort without necessarily improving outcomes or strengthening risk management or assurance. So we're moving to a model that calls more heavily on the evidence that providers already use in their operations to monitor the effectiveness of risk management. Rather than asking for set documents, we'll ask questions like, what are the key risks that you're focused on? How do you assure yourselves that your management of these risks is effective? What are the risks that you anticipate might become more important in the coming years? What evidence and reporting does your governing body rely on to assure itself about academic quality, integrity and student experience? How do you monitor and ensure that third-party providers are delivering in accordance with your policies and the threshold standards? The questions, of course, will vary according to the risks, concerns and challenges relevant to the provider and to the sector at that time. So it will be more tailored to individual providers, it will reflect your circumstances and activities more, but it will also reflect an expectation that where we are calling out risks that apply across the sector, that you're also responding to those. Providers can then share with TEQSA the information that they already rely on, such as dashboards, internal reports, results of improvement activities, internal audit, student feedback, and many, many more, to show how they monitor risk and quality. This approach aligns with the principle of proportionality that TEQSA is required to apply in our regulation. It reduces the needs for providers to produce special documentation for regulatory assessments and recognises that maturity of provider risk management and assurance can actually bring the evidence that is needed for regulatory assessment and allows TEQSA to focus on outcomes rather than inputs. This is not deregulation. It's measured regulation focused on how providers are working to safeguard their operations and their students. Many of you know from the TEQSA conference last year that we've been piloting self-assurance reports with providers. We've also undertaken moderation workshops internally to ensure that they inform valid and reliable assessment of provider risk and responses. It's important to note that self-assurance claims made by a provider must always be supported by evidence. TEQSA will assess this evidence critically and make additional inquiries as needed. However, our experience so far, and that of providers, is that self-assurance reports add value for understanding the risks and the challenges from an individual provider's perspective. This is an important part of our regulatory work. So the third important shift is about how TEQSA will rebalance our regulatory focus. TEQSA's regulatory approach in the past has focused really heavily on scheduled assessments and reassessments, such as re-registration. These are important and will continue to be, but they're narrow in scope and provide pretty limited insights about how providers are responding to issues between assessments. In addition, compliance activities have been largely reactive, depending on issues that have been raised with TEQSA to trigger a regulatory response. We're rebalancing our regulatory approach to increase our focus on sector-wide risks that cross institutional boundaries and, if unmanaged, can cause harm and undermine confidence in the sector. Recent examples of important sector risks include financial resilience, governance capability, academic integrity, underpayment of wages, and safety for students. They haven't applied to all providers or in the same way to all providers, but they're pervasive and important risks that carry potential harms across the sector. So this is not entirely new to any of us. TEQSA has some experience that will inform our approach to sector risks. The Higher Education Integrity Unit has already shown how a sector risk focus to responding to threats to assessment integrity arising from technologies such as generative AI can be managed by the regulator and by the sector. This particular example, of course, is a defining challenge for the sector in order to maintain academic standards and award integrity while embracing innovation. So how's this worked? Our Integrity Unit has conducted ongoing work to identify and analyse emerging risks in this area. We've shared that information and that risk analysis with the sector. We've worked with providers to educate, to build resilience and to understand maturity across institutions and what is needed to respond. Working with experts from the sector to develop best practice guidance has been important to ensuring providers could respond confidently and effectively to these risks. More importantly, through requests for information and targeted engagement, we've built a clearer picture now of how providers are responding, what safeguards are in place and sufficient, and where more work is needed to manage the risks. So this is an important illustration, I think, of how managing key risks and upholding the integrity of Australian higher education awards depends not only on regulatory policy and approach, but also on institutional action about how technology is used and the risks are managed. This experience has informed our thinking about how we need to go about managing other risks and threats to the sector. By extending this kind of approach to other areas, we can identify patterns early and can act before risks compromise quality, integrity and reputation. So as Carl was calling out, it's the importance of being forward-looking and anticipating some of the potential issues and harms that can arise. Another recent example is system-wide concerns about the quality of early childhood educator training. This risk is particular importance because any failings in this area have really important potential consequences and harms for children across Australia. When concerns emerged about graduate preparedness, TEQSA analysed the potential risks and harms. We assessed the scale of the issue across the sector, identified where risks were concentrated and have focused compliance activities accordingly. So potentially sector-wide risks can still yield quite targeted and nuanced responses, but they need that analysis and they need information to be shared appropriately with the sector. So these examples show that sector-focused risks require early detection, sharing of key information and accountability from both providers and TEQSA. These more proactive approaches to sector risk matter because they go to the core of TEQSA's purpose to prevent potential harms, safeguard quality and maintain confidence and trust in Australian higher education. For providers, this will mean TEQSA will share information about key sector risks and how we expect providers to respond. In many instances, providers may be on top of these things, already well advanced with their responses. In those cases, the burden will be very light. In other instances, providers are going to need to consider how these risks apply and what is needed in their response. So that burden will be according to how important the risks are and how effectively they're already being managed. For TEQSA, it means sharper focus and earlier intervention where risk demands it. And for students, it will need to mean greater transparency in how the regulator and the higher education providers are responding to key risks across the sector. I've said already that students often feel the impact of sector risks first, in their classrooms, in their interactions and in their confidence, long before they appear in data and reports, which is very consistent with what Carl has been saying about the importance of being alert to and tuned in, if you like, to some of those early indicators of what's happening. Seeing the sector through the eyes of students gives us early warning of where risk sits and where improvement is needed. This has implications for the ways that providers routinely connect with students and understand their concerns. For TEQSA, it has implications about how we receive and respond to students' concerns and liaise with other key agencies, particularly the National Student Ombudsman, to understand the concerns and experience that students are raising. And yesterday we announced that TEQSA itself will be establishing a student advisory panel as a standing panel to share with us some of the perspectives and insights of students that need to inform our regulatory work. So I've outlined 3 key changes to our regulatory approach, and they represent quite significant shifts that we will develop and roll out over time. They'll underpin TEQSA's new regulatory strategy, shaping how we regulate and assure quality into the future. Importantly, this strategy will provide greater transparency about how we go about our regulatory work, what the boundaries, targets, areas of focus, objectives and limits are of the work that we do. We recognise the importance of being more open and transparent about these things. The development and implementation of the strategy is informed by early consultation with providers and work over the past 3 years. It will take some time to finalise and to implement the strategy. We understand the implications for providers and the need for consultation as we do this work, and for clear communication and lead time. Over coming months, there'll be workshops, roundtables and targeted discussions with providers, experts and student representatives. In the second half of 2026, we'll release a full consultation draft of the regulatory strategy for formal consultation, supported by documentation explaining the basis for the proposed changes. After consultation, TEQSA will settle the strategy and begin phased implementation, supported by guidance and engagement with the sector. Transparency will guide this process. We'll show how feedback shapes the outcome and how TEQSA is accountable for listening and responding. So when regulators speak of change, there's often anxiety about compliance, about oversight, about burden and about what will follow. So let me be clear. This evolution is not about expanding regulatory reach or adding regulatory burden. It's about targeting our efforts to the most important risks to quality, integrity, trust and confidence in Australian higher education. Where provider governance and assurance are strong and adaptive, this approach will feel lighter and clearer. Where improvement is needed, we'll engage early, directly and fairly. Public trust in higher education is not a given and continues to be challenged. Trust is earned and sustained through actions that demonstrate responsibility and quality every day. We believe these changes to our regulatory approach are necessary for confidence in TEQSA as a regulator and for confidence in our higher education sector as a whole. A mature and effective regulator focuses on important risks and acts when necessary and with proportionality. As the public expects, TEQSA needs to ensure it matures its approach and acts fairly, independently and with accountability. We're not building this strategy in isolation, we're building it with the sector, for students and in the public interest. So my message to you is simple. Participate, share and challenge us as we develop and implement our regulatory strategy. Bring your evidence, your experience and your ideas. Tell us what works and what must work better. And we'll tell you back where we think that more may be needed to manage the risk, to cover the gaps, as well as where less might be needed and feasible. This is a moment to shape a regulatory system that is proportionate, transparent and enduring, one that sustains quality, integrity and reputation, and through them protects students and strengthens confidence in Australia's higher education. Thank you all for your commitment to those values and to the students who rely on this system every day. Together we'll move forward with students at the centre and the public interest always in view. And we look forward to working with you in this. Thank you. Now, we have some time for questions. So you can use Slido to share questions with us. And I can see that there are some points coming through. But without dropping the iPad, I'm going to kick off some starter questions for Carl and for John. So, Carl, you've called out really clearly, I think, that there's a culture needed of openness, of being willing to call out risks and problems in order to effectively embed a risk culture in a really meaningful way. I guess the challenge to that is that we also operate in a sort of a societal and sometimes a media culture where people are quick to criticise and condemn just because a problem surfaces. So I'm interested in what your perspective is on how to find that place where calling out problems and responding to risks is actually regarded as part of trust for higher education providers.
Thanks, Mary. That's, absolutely this critical tension between wanting to identify problems, speak up early, raise your voice, and then the continual threat of then facing punitive or other adverse actions simply for speaking up. I think that cuts to the core of what it means to try and create these cultures where people feel able and willing and comfortable speaking up. I suppose there's a few things that spring to mind. One is there's a real need to create essentially protective spaces to have these sorts of conversations. I think that's both within institutions and actually with the regulator. I think there is some very interesting examples that we're seeing across sectors, for example, things like regulatory sandboxes, where you create spaces which bring people together to explore emerging risks, raise concerns, but in a way that is not disclosable, not used for regulatory sanction, is used for genuine exploration, genuine collaborative learning. I think that's one model to create it's almost the irony that you create openness by protecting offer space from disclosure in some sense, which always runs this very difficult tension of not looking to be seen to be then hiding the problems again. So I think there's a lot of it is also down to that very real leadership commitment that makes it clear that speaking up is expected. It's part of what your day job is as a member of staff. It's part of your role as a student, and you should be encouraged and rewarded and expected to take part in that. So I think there's a lot going on there. It's a big challenge.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting an easy answer, but I think that's going to be a challenge for us, particularly as we're looking to mature governance culture, and transparency is an important part of that. So, John, I want to bring you back to the theme that came from Melinda Cilento, as well as from Carl's discussion about the importance of engaging at operational levels, which I would take as being with students, but also with staff. I'm interested in what the Chancellors Council might be considering as ways of actually doing that in reality, that have meaning and consistency.
Great, thanks, Mary. I made the point when I spoke, and I think a lot of Carl's work goes to the mindset and the mental models that we use when we're addressing these kinds of problems. And it's important that we understand that engagement is a skill that needs to be learnt and developed over time. So as a sector, I often hear, but we're autonomous institutions. Well, if you go back in time, the autonomy of our institutions relates to the freedom of, to academic freedoms and to freedom of speech, and the ability to have open dialogue and not be influenced by the ideology of the political system of the day. It's not permission to build walls around things, and so it's a misuse of this autonomy. So the first answer is we've got to build the capability to engage within the universities, and that means building the capacity to engage your critics and to really hear them and listen to them. I think right now, if I focus in on staff and student representation as a practical example, the NTEU, as an example, have said over time that they'd like to see a minimum of 2, including a Senate rep on staff representatives on the council, or 20% of the council. Well, that's not an unreasonable number of people, and yet there's been resistance. But then there's resistance from the same universities who already meet that standard. And then when you look at student representation, you go say, well, we've got undergraduate, we've got postgraduate, we've got online, we've got mature. Well, it probably makes sense to have those same minimums apply. And so I think it's if we get out of this resistance to it and start to engage on what the value of it is, and then where do you go to practically from there? Well, why aren't we more rigorous in setting up the advisory forums that consist of staff that feed directly into council, or advisory forums of students that feed in, potentially with an annual report that is public and we can all discuss? So I often look at the resistance that we see around practical things to engage with a level of bemusement, because in effect it's not that hard. And some of the levers that we need to pull are pretty straightforward levers. Enabling staff and students to be full members of council, where they are in all in-camera conversations, and anybody who has a conflict has to declare it, and we deal with it in the moment. So what I would say is the practical way is don't overcomplex it. Try and work out what is the problem we're really solving for. And then engage in the solutions. And frankly, these are 1-month conversations. They don't need to drag on for years, as some of these things have. So I think it's really about a mindset and how we engage these problems.
Thank you. There'll be a lot more conversations that will need to happen about those things. I'm going to respond to a few of the questions and issues that have been raised, particularly about TEQSA. So a lot of you have asked about the question of regulatory burden and calling out the complexity of the environment, particularly the relationship between expectations and requirements of the Department of Education, ATEC and TEQSA. We'll come back to this as well. I'll ask the chair of the panel discussion this afternoon, where we have representatives from all of these players in your space to address this. But I'll make a few comments. Certainly from TEQSA's perspective, we are acutely aware of the potential for there to be not only multiple but potentially conflicting expectations that providers receive from different entities in this space. Part of our commitment is to make sure that we continue to work very collaboratively and very closely with those other players, timing and aligning guidance and expectations as far as is humanly possible to make sure that you're not dealing with conflicting expectations, you're not dealing with misaligned reporting material periods or multiple requirements for the same information. Certainly, I think that one of the early tasks, as the Minister has mentioned for ATEC, is to look at what can be roughly called red tape and management of data to make sure that the right things are collected, but as far as possible only once and used by as many people as possible, but also to look at it in terms of some of the kind of expectations and requirements. But certainly there are quite a number of recent examples where, from TEQSA's perspective, where we've worked closely, for example, with the Fair Work Ombudsman or with the National Student Ombudsman to make sure that when we're issuing guidance or expectations to the sector around a key risk, it's informed by early and complete conversations so that we are picking up their expectations and we are giving you a very clear message that both organisations are aligned on. So you'll need to expect that of us. We will need to continue that, and that will be an ongoing key point, I guess, for us for engagement with you as our stakeholders. I'm not in any way minimising it as a problem, but I am acknowledging that we are really live to it. So more about that. Okay, so there is a really interesting question about which higher education providers or universities do risk management and governance really well, and what does great look like? I'm going to ask... Well, and I think we have to respond to this from a point of humility, and I'm just really conscious that, I don't want to sit here and say that TEQSA is also perfect around these things. We deal with some of the same challenges around governance, about being connected with our stakeholders. I don't think it's a static thing. I think it's something that varies from time to time. We certainly see universities and other providers that have tracked along really with a lot of stability, a lot of strength, a lot of quality, and then the external environment changes. That may or may not be something that they have prepared for and anticipated, and they may or may not be geared to respond to it easily. Part of what we discussed in the governance workshop yesterday was that really good governance goes well beyond the routine and it anticipates the challenges that might emerge. Even the most mature providers, I think, have found that they've done this to some extent, but not necessarily to the full extent that has been necessary to deal with some of the changes. For example, in the flow of international student enrolments, looking forward, how many providers have wargamed what it might mean for them if the cost of different degrees changes over time. So there is some. I think my answer is there are some who do better at the moment, but may not do better tomorrow. And there is the next piece of work really is about how to embed maturity of good practice and learn from other examples. Certainly when we are talking with governing councils or with universities or other providers, we talk about those things in a safe space. I might ask John, without bias, to just talk about maybe not which providers do it, but what do you think are some of the most important innovative practices that you're starting to see from university executives or governing councils?
Look, I think that I would say there's good examples of practice across each university, and so when we're in a year of, been in a couple of years now where the band-aids are being ripped off, it's easy to kind of assume that everything isn't working, but actually there's an awful lot that is. But we've had some practical experiences recently where we were trying to really understand what is going on with student experience, when particularly as it relates to international education, both domestic and students. And the department said there is no example of best practice but for one university. So we pulled the chancellors together and said, you tell us where the best practice is. We wrote up 6 case studies, we shared them, and then we came out with some guidelines around what good looks like. So I think that, and we've done the same on decasualisation and a number of other areas. The thing that I would point to, though, Mary, is that the sector is highly competitive. The Vice-Chancellors are highly competitive when it comes to their businesses, and therefore the sharing of best practice doesn't happen nearly as much as it could happen. And so I spoke to the Australian Association of University Secretaries a couple of weeks ago and said, you have an incredible role to play in helping to share that best practice so that everybody rises, as Melinda said this morning, rise together. So those great examples get shared, and that doesn't have to be in the areas that you're competitive, but be clear where you can raise it. One university said to me in a regional area, the social licence issues that we're experiencing are on the East Coast, the bigger universities. To which I said, well, then your biggest social licence risk is the failure of others on social licence. You need to have a voice and you need to get involved in changing it, not saying it doesn't affect us, because it will affect you. So I think much more sharing is required so that the genuine areas of excellence are able to come through in our governance.
Thank you. So we are out of time for this part of the proceedings, and just before we change over, we've got quite a lot of really, really good questions and points that we're not able to speak to now. What I'm really happy to do, though, is we will take them away and use them as topics for discussion in future TEQSA talks. So if you're part of subscribing to those, we'll pick up some of these questions and do a bit more of a deep dive, including with questions and answers in future TEQSA talks. Thank you very much for your attention today. Thank you, Carl, and thank you, John, for sharing your particular but surprisingly aligned insights. This is a bit of a journey that we're going to be on together as we move forward. So thank you. We will do a very quick changeover before our next presentation.
Hello, everybody. So the next session, as you're settling down, I'll just introduce the next session, is Trust Through Our Eyes, Balancing Compliance with Care. And the chair for this session, who will also introduce the panellists and do a Q&A, is Stephen Somogyi. I'll introduce him now. Welcome, Stephen.
Good afternoon. It is the afternoon, and we're now standing between you and lunch. But, well, that's the problem. I'm not as tall as you, Mary. I'd like to welcome the most important people on this session, and that's the 5 students who are going to join me on stage. And please take a seat and come up. So I'm privileged to chair this session because the student voice is such an important voice to which we must listen. And you heard quite a bit about that already today. We've heard about some of the issues that have occurred in the last few years and what the various proponents of change are saying should be put in place, and how important it is to have safety on campus, to have a student voice in governance, to ensure that student best interests are being looked after, their wellness, their ability to study and gain good outcomes both for them and for their country are crucial for the sector to achieve together. And so listening to the student voice is an important aspect of that. Before I invite each of the speakers to say a few words from their own perspective, I'll introduce them as I ask each of them to speak. But what we've heard so far today is an illustration that you've got to learn from the past, you've got to manage the present, and there's flux going on all the time, and you've got to manage what you've got, but you've got to be open and listening to creating the future, anticipate the issues rather than just react to them. And I think that's come through in the presentations that we've heard so far today. So, as I introduce you, if you wouldn't mind speaking for a few minutes about the key issues that you see, and then I'll move on to the next person. So, first up is Ashlyn Horton. Now, Ashlyn is both the president of the National University Students in the country. She's also a maths and international studies student at the ANU. So, Ashlyn, you've got the floor.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is a really great panel to be on because I think that when we talk about giving students a genuine voice, we do need to recognise that students are the primary stakeholders in higher education. And so it is quite counterintuitive that it feels like we're more often than not the last people to know about the decisions that affect us more than anyone. So I think something that is really important to talk about at the moment is genuine co-design. When we're looking at the issues around university governance and the trust that has kind of been eroded between universities and their students, I think it does stem from the fact that students just aren't involved in decision-making processes from the beginning. We are consulted, but that's really only after decisions have already kind of been made, and we're asked for feedback rather than being part of the solution. And even then, with being able to identify what the problems are, I think something that we've talked a little bit about today is the quality of education that's being provided, and how that kind of has gone down a little bit, or a lot in some cases. And, you know, something that I've been hearing a lot about how we fix the quality of education and student satisfaction is making teaching staff have more teaching qualifications. But as students, as the people who are actually in the classrooms, we would say that the issues aren't the teachers themselves, it's the class sizes. Because, you know, 20 years ago, your tute would be maybe 15 people. Now it's around 40 in some cases. I said I wouldn't speak too much about the ANU, but I will just a tiny little bit. We have students who have to sit on the floor in their tutes because they're just so overcrowded. You can't allocate yourself to a tutorial time in the timetabling system because the courses are so overcrowded. So when we talk about quality of education and the quality of teaching, I think that that's something that really has to be considered. But if you didn't ask students what we thought about that, then I think a lot of people would say, oh, the issues are the teaching staff themselves. Anyway, sorry. But over the past year, obviously, something we've been involved in a lot is the changes around university governance. And I think this year has been the first time in a very, very long time where the sector has actually spoken to each other. All the peak bodies, the Chancellors Council, Universities Australia, the NUS, Kappa, I think we've all been in communication like we haven't before. And it's been very, very interesting to see that we just have a lot of common interests that we just haven't realised until now. And it really makes me wonder how we have gotten this far without having such a high level of communication. Because we're all in this together, but it feels like we're all in separate bubbles when that is simply not the case. And so I think that to properly rebuild trust in students, we need to properly be including them in these conversations from the very, very beginning, not just at the end. And I don't think I have anything else to say.
Got 1 minute, Ashlyn?
Yes?
Got 1 more minute.
Oh, right. Sorry.
I got
Let's
4
see.
others to cover as well.
Okay. Well, I guess something else is now that we are seeing such changes in the structures of TEQSA and bringing ATEC in, and we've also got the NSO now, which is super exciting. I think that it is quite important for those bodies to also be engaging with students and including students in those conversations, which is why the announcement that TEQSA will be establishing a student advisory body is super exciting. But it is really important that that advisory body doesn't just turn into a consultation body, because that's how we've ended up in the situation we're in. Is that good? Thank you.
Thanks, Ashlyn. Very good. And you can ask Ashlyn lots of questions, and that reminds me that I forgot that I should invite you to enter your questions in the Slido so I can put them to the panel. I'll introduce the next speaker. So that's Jesse Gardner-Russell. He has 2 roles. He's the National President of the Council of Australian Postgraduate Associations, and he's also a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne. So, Jesse?
It's a real pleasure to be here. So my name's Jesse. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne, as just been said. I study ophthalmology. I look at how to recover people's vision after stroke. And I'm also involved at the Council of Australian Postgraduates, where a lot of our work this year has been focused on how do we improve the conversation around research and development funding? How do we improve the way that postgraduates are able to communicate with universities? And as well, how do we support international students to have their say? But to us at Kappa, we often ask ourselves the question of what is the point of a university? I've been very fortunate to have had a broad experience of tertiary education. I come from regional Victoria. I did TAFE. I also then did a bachelor's, an honours, and a master's. My HEC stat actually isn't that high. A
glutton for punishment?
But for us, a university is a special place. It is a place where we research, where we educate, and where we uphold intellectual integrity. And that's why TEQSA and what the work that we all do here is so important, because without TEQSA, we don't have the standards for education and the standards for research training, and as well, we would lack that intellectual integrity for our system. And for postgrads, that's essential. We need universities to succeed. About 50% of HDRs would like to work in academia, and about 20% of the teaching staff are postgraduate students. And so we don't just need them to succeed, we want universities to succeed. But what does trust from us look like? So for us, when we look at the higher education standards thresholds, at section 6.3, there's a little item about the involvement of student participation in academic governance. And Ashlyn touched on some really good points about involving students from the beginning. There's a lot of fantastic work that happens from our student services staff, from academics, often later in the piece around the processes and how we can refine how we do things at universities. And that can be achieved through many different forums, whether they're lived experience advisory groups or other kinds of mechanisms. But often that work is to sort of fix things at the end point or to help tune things up at the end point. But at Kappa, what we believe is that student participation can actually look like having postgrads and undergrads in the engine room of developing those policies from the outset. As postgrads, we come from a diverse range of backgrounds. Most of us are 30 or older. Many come from different backgrounds, from working, or they've raised families. They might already be medical doctors, or they might be doing their second PhD, the real gluttons for punishment.
1 minute.
And we're not only the engine room of university research, we're also the engine room of new ideas in universities, because we are the ones that will eventually be, hopefully, if there's a sector left, to help lead the universities. And so for Kappa, what we really would ask is people to think about how can we change how that section 6.3 is actually operationalised and moved towards bringing postgrads into the policy development room where we can help iron out those issues from the outset instead of trying to tune them up at the end.
Thanks, Jesse. Well said. The next speaker is Billy Bent-Ngawaka. He's an occupational therapy student from Western Sydney University, and he's a Ngunnawal and Māori man. So welcome, Billy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please don't mind any stutters or anything. Don't really talk in front of crowds. But the topic I'd like to speak about today is the implementation of care for Indigenous students navigating tertiary education institutions. So, as just said, I'm studying at Western Sydney University, and I found the subject of care for the Indigenous students there very, very good, actually. So even before I started university, before I started my degree, Western was very involved throughout my high school journey and reshaping my ideology that university wasn't just for the higher socioeconomic classes, and that university was a real opportunity for myself and my Indigenous peers at high school. But so that was part of the Pathways to Dreaming program that Western offers. So it's an alternative entry scheme that, again, promotes the idea that university is for Indigenous peoples and it's a safe space. And once I actually got into Western, accepted last year, that's when I was introduced to the Indigenous Education Centre at Western, the Badnami Centre, which is a fantastic centre. They really provide a culturally safe environment. They promote academic success, a home away from home sort of vibe. and the staff at all our Badnami centres are just, again, quite excellent. Academically, they provide a lot of tutoring opportunities. So there's a program called TFS, Tutoring for Success. I was part of this last year, which is a free tutoring scheme for Indigenous students to better themselves and just attain better study routines and stuff from other Indigenous students who have graduated or are still currently studying. Another academic service that the uni provides is, just reading my notes here, the promotion of scholarships. So Western does a fantastic job at promoting Indigenous scholarships. I've actually attained one. It was the Futures Indigenous Startup Scholarship, I think. And that was a grant of $2,000, and that really helped me kickstart my academic career. Beyond that, Western also has a lot of cultural leadership experiences. So fortunately enough, I've got to experience a lot of these programs. One of them was the Taiwanese exchange program, where a group of Indigenous students from Western got to go to Taiwan and interact with a few of the universities there and just see how their Indigenous people of Taiwan experience tertiary education systems also. That was a fantastic opportunity for myself. Also, I've been privileged to attend the Indigenous National Games, which is a sporting event, which is great for cultural networking. I've met so many new friends from across the country, so many different pathways into university and experiences as Indigenous people in the tertiary education system. And I guess just having the idea of care and ensuring the well-being of Indigenous students in
Sorry, Billy.
That's all right. In universities and other tertiary education institutions is that it's vital because it's not often seen as a space for Indigenous people, and those sort of ideas are still very present within a lot of our communities and stuff. So just breaking down those systematic barriers for Indigenous people is vital for universities. So yeah, thank you.
Good on you, Billy, and there's a lot of really good ideas there for everyone to think about in their own environments, and thanks for doing that. Well done. So the second to last speaker, Devashya Bessie. She's a theology student from Alphacrucis University College, and she's also from another land originally. So Devashya, floor is yours.
Hi everyone, my name is Devashya and I'm an international student from Indonesia studying at Alphacrucis University College. And I like to discuss something we don't often talk about when it comes to compliance through the lens of an international student. International students don't just follow policies, but we live inside multiple systems at once. And the moment I arrived in Australia, I realized something institutions sometimes forget, that international students aren't just adjusting to rules, we're also adjusting to an entire different worldview. Firstly, there are two systems, two cultures, and one student caught in the middle. When I left Indonesia, I didn't just leave my home, my culture, and my community, but I also left a system where people explain things verbally, rules bend depending on context, and community fills the gaps. Then I suddenly entered Australia's system where everything is structured, documented, and non-negotiable. So compliance isn't just learning about rules, it's learning how a whole country thinks. And if institutions don't help us translate the two systems, we don't just feel confused, but we can unintentionally harm ourselves. Not because we're careless, but because we're operating with the logic of two different countries. That's something only international students experience, and something institutions rarely see from our point of view. Secondly, compliance becomes support when it translates instead of instructs. What helped me at Alphacrucis wasn't just that they told me what the rules were, it's that they translated the rules into something my world could understand. I felt supported when staff explained not just the requirement, but the reason behind it. That made me feel comfortable to abide by the rules. I wasn't just following a rule, I was understanding it, and that's when compliance stops feeling like policing and starts feeling like care. And I think that the biggest gap in higher education is that students don't struggle because the rules are strict. We struggle because the rules are spoken in a language that we haven't learned or we're not familiar yet. And for an international student, it's the language of an Australian system. Next, what institutions often underestimate is that institutions often see compliance as a risk mitigation. But for students, especially international students, compliance is something that is emotional. Why is it emotional? It's because it affects our visa, our stability, our safety, and our identity. Plus, when you're far from home, one misunderstanding can feel like your whole future is at risk. And it's not just for us personally, but we carry the name of our country with us. So any mistake or misunderstanding of policy can affect not only our future personally, but also the opportunities and perception of future international students or even current international students from our country. So when Alphacrucis or any higher education institution takes the time to explain, to follow up, to check in, and support students personally, it doesn't just help us stay compliant, but it makes us feel safe, it makes us feel human, and makes us feel that we belong in a system built differently from our own. One thing I really value studying in Australia is that, and also Alphacrucis, is that students actually sit on the academic board and council. That may seem normal for staff, but as a student, especially an international student, it sends a strong message that you are not subject to the system, but you are also part of shaping it. And for me, that is powerful because when students are part of the governance of compliance, trust becomes real and not just theoretical. Therefore, compliance becomes meaningful only when institutions understand that they're not teaching rules, they're teaching students how to survive inside a new system. And the more human, relational, and clear the approach is, the safer we feel, the better we follow, and the deeper the trust becomes. Thank you.
Excellent words, Devashya, said from the heart. So our last speaker, but by no means the least of them, is Lohit Roy. He's a Master of International Relations student at the University of Melbourne, but he also holds a role as a policy intern in higher education at the Australian Technology Network of universities. So an important, influential role as well in that respect. Lohit, the floor is yours.
So I'm going to start off with a little story. Trust me, it's relevant. A couple of weeks ago, I dropped by the place of a friend of mine. We had decided to watch a movie together. And we hadn't met for a while, deadlines and work and things of that nature. So she asked me what I was up to. I said I'd be speaking to all of you at the TEQSA conference. But there was a blank look on her face. So I immediately stumbled over my words explaining that this is the Tertiary Education Qualities and Standards Agency. But to my horror, the look on her face still persisted. It was completely blank. And at that moment, I figured out that for some people, they aren't as interested as I am in the regulatory frameworks of higher education. And I think on that day, something in our friendship died. I think what does this anyway have to do with a conversation about trust, right? I think in the social sciences, something that we've talked about trust has been that it's something that's built through repetition. Essentially, it's about consistently seeing certain norms and behaviors followed. So while students like my friend might never have accessed the resources that are available on the TEQSA website or even know what the regulator is all about, that she can sense check to a certain degree the trust that is accorded to these institutions, to providers, and to the regulator, even in her ignorance, There's both, I think, both providers and regulators have a combined role to play in developing a communication of trust and care for students and any other relevant interest groups. So regulators like TEQSA already have certain resources available to it in order to build communications of care. These include regulatory expectations, guidance notes, proactive issue-specific interventions. Some of these things we've already seen in the conference yesterday in the various seminars. So, for example, TEQSA has just released guidance on AI assessment reform and has previously taken a stand on sexual harassment and assault. These signals show that TEQSA is ready to stand up for students. And at the same time, on the other side of the equation, there's the education providers themselves. While working at the ATN, I've had the excellent opportunity to contribute to many submissions. One of the proudest for me was the recent Disability Standards Review 2025. And working on that, I can genuinely say that providers are also working to signal care. In the piece that in the submission that we sent off, we suggested or advocated for things like universal design for learning, which means building diversity into the educational model from the start, which allows us to imagine a future where students with disability don't have to ask for adjustments at all. This shows, I think, a proactive kind of care. Finally, I think, in essence, trust in higher education is a partnership, both between TEQSA and the providers. Both are working together to communicate care to students, and ultimately trust is strengthened when we make that care visible, and crucially, it should be consistent. Yeah, I think that's pretty much what I have to say.
Well said, Lohit. Said from the heart, and very good. And by the way, in case you have any spare time, could become a stand-up comic as well.
Thank you.
We've got some really good questions. Thank you very much for your input. Keep them coming. We've got a few minutes before lunch. Ashlyn, I cut you off at the start, so I'll let you take the first question. I'll read it out. You can see the words there. We really, really want to engage more with students from the very beginning. The question is, how exactly do students want to be engaged with? Ashley.
Well, I think this isn't a cookie-cutter situation. I can't give you an answer that everyone will agree with, because what works at one university will not work at another. And so I think that, but overall, I think that universities need to look at the systems that already exist and how they can be used. If you look at your average student association, they'll probably have an education officer. That education officer exists to sit on these panels and to represent students in academic spaces. So it's really not that difficult to read your local student union constitution and read role descriptions. I think that's an awesome place to start, because at the end of the day, something that's really important about student engagement in these spaces is giving students the empowerment to elect the people who are going to represent them. Appointing students to things is not building trust. if you want to show that you trust us and you genuinely want to engage with students, you need to give them the power to tell you who they want to speak for them. Yeah.
Thanks, Ashlyn. Does anyone else want to add? No? All right, just you're next with the second question. I'll read it out. You can see it. What do you see as practical ways to engage students in meaningful and practical partnership and co-design, as distinct from student representation? So a little bit of the first question in there, but more about co-design.
Perfect. So I've had the absolute pleasure of working on 2 university policies in my time as a student representative. This includes the research and training policy at the University of Melbourne, as well as the academic integrity policy. And where this experience was quite distinct, and also, in my mind, a genuine case of co-design, was that I was included as a full member of the working group with the open access to the shared Word document, where we line by line went through the policy, taking into account the pain points that students had with the policy. And in the case of research training, a lot of issues that HDRs face, they might be very distinct from each other, but there's often a lot of core issues that we would constantly face. And as a student rep, as a student leader, I would get emails about on a regular basis. And having that opportunity to sit down and feed that directly into the writing of the policy, to the point where I also got to help write it, meant that we were able to iron out some of those issues as a team. That we had the debates in this working group, including representatives from the academic board, academics, university leadership as well, where we were able to come together and figure out what would actually work best for the students, what meets the needs of the university. In this case, we were also implementing the Viva oral examination as well. So how do we balance what the students need from the policy with the direction that we want to take with research training? And then as well, the expertise of academics that are on the ground, that are supervisors, that are working from the other side, that need to balance the workloads that our academics are working towards. And when it comes to, I guess, to help answer some of the previous question about how do we, I guess, find or how do we get and increase student participation, I think it also comes down to what kind of work we are wanting to do. There are some cases where you do need the lived experience of the directly impacted students. And that might call for slightly different bodies and different ways of recruiting those students to give their input than, say, a university policy where you would want student representatives that have resourcing behind them through their student association, through staff, to provide them as well some background and briefings and give them a bit more experience and a bit more understanding in the sort of space. And they're also regularly talking with students and dealing with student issues. So they get a lot of emails. I know I did. But then I think that at its core, it's about letting students have a seat at the table, and that is how we not only build trust, but it makes it meaningful, because at the end of the day, we do have an idea about the issues students face, and if we are given a genuine seat at the table, that's what we're asking for as postgrads, and that's what we want to contribute at the earliest stage that we can to help.
Thanks, Jesse. Another question that's fast rising in popularity is, with so many staff and educators in attendance today, and they're all listening to you, what's the biggest issue they're all missing or misunderstanding? Devashya, do you want to tackle that question?
from obviously an international student's point of view, as much as we're struggling with the language barrier, I believe that institutions also have the, well, not issue, but, struggle of also communicating with us on like policies and compliance. So, well, maybe my take is that understand from a common ground that it's for the common good for everyone, so that there won't be like any misunderstandings in the future or even risks that might affect the safety of international students. I think I'll just, yeah.
Well, safety of students is an important element. Thank you. Lohit, I'll get you to answer this one. It's a tricky question, and you may want to think about it before you answer. If students are to be authentic partners, then they should also be paid for the work they do. What kind of model would this look like, and is it sustainable? You might get an argument right across the room.
TEQSA has been actually very nice on this. They're paying all of us to speak today. But honestly, I don't think I could give you an intelligent answer on the sort of model that this would look like. I think the conversation is about care, and I think there should be a consideration about students in almost every aspect of the decision making. But I generally don't have much to offer on what that model would look like. You'd have to ask someone else.
Okay, does anyone else want to take part in that? Yes, Billy.
I guess just a stab in the dark for what kind of model it could look like. Maybe something like a casual employment, just to balance out the studies and the actual employment, and partnership with staff and stuff like that. So yeah, just.
Good suggestion, Billy. So you can answer this is the last question, I promise. So if you could change just one thing at your university, what would you change? You've already said how great it is.
I guess it depends on what aspect. A lot of the time the Wi-Fi isn't the best. No, I can't really say I'd change much, to be honest. Anything else?
Want to tackle that one? Jeff, go ahead.
Increased research funding from the government would be great.
I'm not sure there's anyone in the room who can do that one for you. Ashlyn?
I need everyone to keep in mind I go to the ANU. So,
You've only got one day.
Look, I'm going to be so honest, the Chancellor. I'm so sorry, but there's a lot that needs to change at the ANU.
Thank you, Ashlyn. We won't open up that topic, but thank you very much for your attention, and thank the students, please.
Thank you very much, everyone. That's been a fantastic session, starting with the broader understanding about applying systems thinking to manage regulatory risks and build trust with Dr. Mary Russell and also Carl and John. And thank you very much for that last session, Stephen, and also to the fantastic students and all of their responses as well. So we're now at lunch, which I'm sure we're all very excited about. So lunch is going to be available at Sophie's Lounge, with also dining rooms available at La Trobe and Fitzroy ballrooms. The afternoon session will commence at 1:45. Thanks, everyone.